Welcome to episode 236 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to former task force officer Giovanni Rocco and retired FBI agent Anthony Zampogna. In this episode, Giovanni and Anthony review Operation Charlie Horse, their long-term undercover operation investigating Mafia capo Charlie Stango and the New Jersey DeCavalcante Mafia family, known as the Real Sopranos. Giovanni, a New Jersey police officer, using his undercover name Giovanni Gatto, infiltrated the crime family, and the Newark Division Organized Crime Task Force, supervised by Anthony, ultimately charged and convicted 10 members and associates of the DeCalvacante family. Now, you can find longer versions of their bios in the show notes for this episode, but let me tell you a little bit about Giovanni and Anthony. Giovanni Rocco served over 26 years working in law enforcement alongside local, state, and federal agencies. He was assigned as a Federal Task Force Officer, TFO, for over 20 years with both the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and the FBI, where he held a top-secret security clearance. Currently, Giovanni is a security consultant and covert operations expert and travels throughout the world as a trainer and guest speaker, sharing his expertise and life experience as it pertains to his personal and professional life. Giovanni is the author of Giovanni's Ring, My Life Inside the Real Sopranos, where he details his infiltration of the DeCalvacante crime family, on which the HBO show The Real Sopranos is based. Now, retired agent Anthony Zampogna served 22 years with the FBI. He began his bureau career in the New York office, where he was assigned first to security fraud and then later transferred to the organized crime squad, where he participated in highly successful investigations targeting the Bonanno and DeCalvacante crime families, as well as transnational investigations of the Sicilian Mafia. Anthony was promoted to supervisory positions at FBI headquarters and was the unit chief leading inspection programs for human source operations supporting counterterrorism investigations. He requested a field assignment to the Newark Division, where he supervised the Organized Crime Task Force. In this assignment, he oversaw Operation Charlie Horse. When he retired, Anthony was supervising the Newark Division's Public Corruption Squad. Currently, he is the Director of Fraud and Program Integrity for Pfizer Incorporated. Before we get to the episode, I want to thank everyone who attended the Zoom meetup with retired agent Kathy Sturman about her book, It's Not About the Gun. I recorded the event, and Kathy will be releasing the audio to her newsletter members as soon as I get it to her, hopefully later this week. I want to welcome new listeners to the podcast and invite you to join my reader team, where once a month I keep you up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. In the July email, I review the FBI profiler movie Bloodwork, starring and directed by Clint Eastwood. There's a link to where you can join my reader team in your podcast app's description of this episode. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Anthony Zampogna and retired task force officer Giovanni Rocco. Hi guys, how are you?
Hello, Jerry.
Hi, Jerry. Doing great.
I spent the weekend reading Giovanni's new book, Giovanni's Ring, My Life Inside the Real Sopranos. And it was fascinating. I already mentioned to you that I found the ending kind of sad, but we'll talk about that at the end. I thought before we get into the case that Anthony provide us a little bit more information about how a task force officer gets to a point where they're working undercover in a major investigation for the FBI. So, Anthony, could you tell us more about this organized crime task force in the Newark division that you supervised?
Sure, Jerry. I transferred into Newark from FBI headquarters for my first field assignment as a supervisor, and I took over management of the organized crime task force there. And, a task force is made up of a group of FBI agents along with police officers from whether state or local police departments in that area, so that we can leverage the experience and work together to combat various types of crime issues. And here specifically, we were looking at organized crime, and we deputized the police officers to have authority to investigate federal crimes, and that's our focus. And this is where Giovanni and I met, my supervising him. And the reality is Giovanni was part of the task force. I managed the relationship with his police department, but, he was not unique in being an undercover employee. And, the experience of an undercover employee who's very good at what they do in the FBI, that skill really kind of focuses what their responsibility becomes. It's just their talent drives their work. Giovanni, although he was assigned to the task force, he was primarily an undercover officer. So he was part of whether working a case on the task force or working a case for another squad in Newark or working a case for another field office. It gave, it really enriched the FBI's pool of talented undercovers. And it's a large number of individuals, but it's a small community within the FBI, those who really have that talent. So during the course of my working with Giovanni, he was working, undercover assignments, whether it was terrorism within the Newark field office or Asian organized crime on the West Coast. He juggled a lot of different responsibilities. So his responsibilities went way beyond what we did on the task force, but it really all did culminate in the case that we're going to talk about today.
And Giovanni, I take it that this case was not necessarily the largest one, but one that you remember the most because it was your last assignment.
Yes, Jerry. First off, thanks for reading my book. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here and share the experiences with Anthony and you. Yeah, it was not the biggest case I ever worked, but it was the most in-depth and complex case and ultimately did cause the demise of my law enforcement career. But it was some of the best work I've ever done in law enforcement. And I was fortunate to be able to do it under the eyes of the FBI.
Well, I guess the sexiest part of your book title is My Life Inside the Real Sopranos. So why don't either one of you explain what that means?
Well, I'll jump in before Anthony. I'm going to turn it to him to explain the DeCalvacantes because he is what I consider the subject matter expert on them with his history. But as far as it goes with the Sopranos, there's been a lot of talk of who is the family that influenced the series, The Sopranos. And I name it that because from what I've seen on The Sopranos, and we've all watched it who are Mafia fans or, Underworld fans, everything in that show reminded me of the life that I was living within that crime family. Down to when I went on record at the pork store, it was, very similar, and personalities and the people that I met along the way are actually names taken to use in the Sopranos series. They are the same individuals, the same characteristics, and that New Jersey mentality. So it was a double-edged sword for me because at the time, James Gandolfini had passed away in this case. So late in our case of Charlie Horse, they were showing repeats constantly on the TV of the Sopranos series. So when I tried to leave my life in the real mafia, I would come home, try to decompress and watch a little TV, and there it was right up in my face. So I was living it on the TV and I was living in real life. So that's why I chose My Life Inside the Real Sopranos, because I wanted people to understand what the New Jersey Mafia especially was and the connections to the underworld as it is today.
Anthony, people know about the New York organized crime families, but until The Sopranos, there really wasn't a lot of notoriety when it came to the New Jersey crime families. Could you tell us more about the families that are in New Jersey? And then we'll get down to Operation Charlie Horse.
New York has the major 5 families, which historically have always existed. And they have operated, and they still operate within New Jersey. And New Jersey, because of its geographic, connection to New York and Philadelphia, where there's an organized crime family that has historically existed in Philadelphia. They've all been active in New Jersey, and there's been plenty of crimes and turf battles that have happened throughout the decades. But the DeCalvacante family is, the primary crime La Cosa Nostra family in northern New Jersey. And I came to learn more about it when I was assigned originally to the New York office, working on an organized crime squad, where the DeCalvacante family crossed into New York, and we developed a case there. As Giovanni said, back when I think the Sopranos TV series originally came on air, we were working a major case against the DeCalvacante family. And we recorded conversations back then of members of that family actually discussing how they started to notice that storylines in the TV series were really taken from their true stories. And a lot of what we prosecuted in court and became part of the public record, I think some of that made its way into those storylines. So, really, art was imitating life and crossing back and forth. I had worked the DeCalvacante family back then, and the specific target we ended up going after here in this case with Giovanni. So we understood the target, and, it really, our combination of working together ended up advancing this investigation.
And Giovanni, had you worked undercover in an organized crime case before this assignment?
I did, Jerry. I worked a couple right before this. Well, my experience came from growing up in Hudson County, New Jersey. I grew up amongst gangsters my whole life, all different kinds, but mostly around the Italian Mafia. That was my neighborhood. I grew up in that culture. I knew the life growing up. I knew the life from the law enforcement side and the criminal side. So I was very familiar with the mannerisms and what to do. So before this Charlie horse case kicked off, I did a couple of other ones. We had worked a major case out of the New Jersey division, and the C4 squad work. It was complex. I had done some cameos in it. And then before that, I worked a case where it was an international case that we had some guys come over from Italy, from the motherland, and came here to do some business. So I got my feet wet a little bit before this.
Right. And you had mentioned your neighborhood and growing up with organized crime figures all around you. But we should also mention that your father was actually a police detective.
Yeah, he was a city cop in Hudson County. I grew up being the son of actually third generation law enforcement I was, and my father being an investigator. So I did have that experience as a young kid with him coming home with the stories, and, there was no real filter there. I was able to be exposed to very early on. I was exposed to autopsy photos and things that hardened me a little bit when it came time to work undercover. So nothing really was a shock and awe to me if I had seen something in the street, even as I became a detective myself. So I'm blessed. I'm blessed to have had that experience. Some would say it was a little bit traumatizing, but it wasn't, because it prepared me for the life ahead of me. And I think it gave me all the experience I needed to do in my law enforcement career.
Well, I know that he gave you an endorsement on the back of your book, and I'm talking about our mutual friend, Jack Garcia. And he talks about having to go to mob school in order to learn how these particular mob figures acted and talked and spoke. But I guess you didn't need mob school.
Right. Mob school I didn't need. Mob 101 I had passed, and then I gained my master's degree in mob early on. But it was late in my career that I was sent to the FBI covert school. And as I wrote in the book, although I had some great experience working undercover years before, they thought it would be very challenging to have me assessed and maybe to break the mold that I was. I was self-taught. I had some basic narcotics investigation schools I had attended, but nothing deep cover. But when it did come time for the FBI school, there was a lot of fiery hoops I had to jump through and prove that I wanted to be trained. And I did. I begged for that spot. I think because I was a seasoned detective, I understood the need for me to be trained, because I explained to them, if I wanted to train somebody or bring somebody into a case with me, if they learned it my way might not be the right way. I didn't have any official training up until that point. And it was important for me to have it, because when I retired one day and left people behind, I didn't want to rub off the stupidity, let's call it, of what I was doing in the street, all the wrong things I was doing. And when I did, I was fortunate in the FBI school. They taught us every technique. They enhanced us. And everything I learned in the street was like put on steroids. So I was honored. And yes, Jack is, he's one of the founders of that school, along with a couple other guys. And, he paved the way for us. And it was their work that actually added to our training. And I'm honored to have Jack give the review for the cover and read the book and welcome me into the family. I did have a conversation with Jack, and I was very humbled by it when he welcomed me into a small family, he called it. That's when I realized how important the work I did was when Jack actually approved of it and gave his stamp of approval.
Well, I know that a lot of times people talk about learning things on the street and, formal education, and they kind of have a negative idea of, book learning or formal education. But it sounds like you really believe that the undercover school is a worthwhile experience that should not be skipped.
It is. If you have the stamina to do it and you can get into it, I would encourage anyone that wants to go down this path, anybody in the FBI, to give it a shot. It's not easy. It's not an easy thing. They test you, and it's a very difficult thing to go through. But if you come out on the other side, you can do some great work and really, truly make a difference. That's when the real work starts to get done.
And you're kind of making it sound like SEALs training or something, kind of like a boot camp.
Well, I can say that it's been watched over by such people that you mentioned, and comments have been made and told us that you guys are crazy for doing this. Why would you put yourself through this? But again, it's to familiarize yourself with the things that you can come up against in the real world. We're not filming an episode on TV. We don't get a second take. You either get it right the first time or things can go horribly wrong. So the training has to go into it to make sure you know what you're doing. Not acting by any means.
So who decided to name it Operation Charlie Horse, and what does it mean?
There were a couple of reasons why. The squad that had it initially, they chose it. The case agents that chose Operation Charlie Horse. I guess each case has a special meaning to the case agent. You get to don your name or whatever name you want for your case. And there were a couple little things in there that I guess Charlie Horse came about because when we decided to target Charlie Stango, of course, and then there were some individuals named Horse in the family, within the family, because as you know, nicknames are everything in the mafia. You have something for the size of your ears, the size of your body, or, a football team that you just get a street name. So Charlie at times went by Horse, and I think Charlie Horse was what the case agent had picked at the time.
Who was Charlie Stango when it came to the DeCalvacante family?
Charlie Stango was a long time associate and then member of the DeCalvacante family. Having investigated him prior, I knew his history back to the 1960s. He was known to the FBI, and he was an active player, an old school gangster who operated in New Jersey. He ended up on the West Coast. He was down in Florida. He existed in the underworld. He had a history of violent crime. He had served time for committing a murder. And when I was in New York, I worked a case that I ended up putting him in jail 15 years prior for conspiracy to commit murder. So we knew him as a true gangster who was a threat. And during the course of this investigation, he came out of jail and went right back to what he knew, which was to advance himself within the Cavalcante family, to rise to higher ranks. And he did that while the case was going on.
And when did this case take place? It was in the mid 2000s, right? 2015. I mean, it was not that long ago.
Yeah, I mean, it started around 2012 through 15.
So, Giovanni, what was your assignment? If you could talk about your role as the undercover as opposed to the role of the case agent.
My role in this case as an undercover, we're a tool in the case agent's toolbox. A case agent can be the investigator who goes and creates a situation where they can develop a human source. They can go up on what we know to be a Title III, a wiretap. They can do video surveillance, physical surveillance. It's their job to make the case. And usually the undercovers are brought in when you've thrown everything else, every other tool has been used in your toolbox, and you're really having a hard time coming at this subject and who you want to infiltrate or prosecute and build a case on. that's when we're brought out of the woodwork. That's when, okay, I got my sharpest tool in the box. I'm going to send these guys in and see what we can do and see what we can dig up. We don't make things happen. We let the situation unfold for us. It's not like we go in and, it's very sensitive, and it's a technique that we use, and case agent will decide. It's a long road for a case agent to go down to do an undercover case. There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of administrative stuff to get approved. So it's a marriage. You're really marrying the case. You're marrying the undercover, and you have to trust the undercover, because the case agent, as you all know, the case agent's reputation is on the line. So there's a lot of thought that goes into it. This particular case, I was brought into it because it was a cocaine purchase. It was just not a simple street buy. It was a large purchase of cocaine. And I was asked as a cameo role to come in. And what I normally did, Jerry, was and I'm okay saying it, I'm the stink. I bring the stink to the party. I'm the street guy. I could turn it on. I could turn it off. I could be polished, or I could be the biggest turd in the world. And I could be just as street and down and dirty as anyone, and I could turn it on and off if I need to. So in this particular case, I was brought down to do a cocaine purchase, and went down to Atlantic City just as a cameo. It was a night where my wife, who was also law enforcement at the time, she told me, listen, you have the kids in the morning. You better be back here. You're going to AC to do this purchase, but you better come back. You got the kids in the morning. I don't care what it is. She was working sex crimes at the time, and she knew she could be called out at any moment. So I rushed down there, and we dragged the case out for a few hours, and I was really, really mad because I knew I would be in trouble, and I didn't want to get yelled at when I got home. So when these guys showed up, they showed up late, very late in the evening, almost too late. We waited for a long time, and eventually they did show up. And I was just my typical self, very aggravated, very dismissive of them, which built a little bit of bona fides because they thought I was a serious guy. And that just kind of sprungboarded me into them wanting to do more business. And then when it came to time to make another purchase and put these guys to bed in this cocaine case, drug case, I'll do this quick. I'll knock this out of the park. I'll get it done real fast. We'll do a couple of purchases. We'll put these guys to bed, and we'll move on to the next case. Or we'll move up the chain if we're lucky enough, and we'll find out who their suppliers are, and then make more purchases from the next individual. Not realizing that this would turn into Operation Charlie Horse at the time. That's why it did turn into, and it was the relationships I built with the drug dealers and the people like Jimmy Smalls, and then moving up the chain from there, and then introduced to Luigi Oliveri, and then ultimately introduced to Charlie Stango. And that's how the case evolved.
That's really interesting. You got this connection, this introduction to Charlie Stango, and that's where the actual operation takes off.
It was. And it was the relationship I built along the way. The relationship I built with the initial person, Jimmy Smalls, then with Luigi Oliveri, and then ultimately not knowing we would ever be introduced to Charlie Stango, and not knowing that I would build such a close relationship with Charlie. We never thought in a million years. I don't think that was not planned. That just evolved naturally. He took to me, I took to him. And from there, it was just, what would you call it, Anthony? A little bit of a rat's nest to handle at times.
It wasn't easy, but I think you make a very good point. It was your skill as an undercover and your understanding the environment and the landscape, and just, your skills in engaging an individual, which, it's like any relationship. It just developed to where it was, and a trust developed. And that is, to me as a supervisor, watching, a skilled undercover work, that is the pinnacle. It's beautiful work to be able to work in the environment. An undercover is constantly managing multiple issues. It's not just the environment that they're trying to exist in, but they're also trying to build the law enforcement case. And all of that was going on. And we're constantly trying to evaluate every day what's happening in the case to manage it and propel it forward.
Giovanni, before we move on, you've got to let us know, did you make it home in time?
I did not make it home in time.
So that was the beginning.
I did not make it. But I'll tell you what, Jerry, I lost a lot of sleep that night because I made sure my butt was up early the next morning.
I really related to that because I'm sure Anthony can relate to it. You're supposed to be home at a certain time and you got to make that call and say you're not coming home. And so throughout the book, I think that's one of the things that I truly appreciated is that you shared with us those issues of you not being home. And I had to ask you this question. When you were talking about your early days as a child watching your father do his job and the fact that he wasn't at home as much as he should have been, and he did apologize to you later, as you got older. Yeah, I hate to put you on the spot, but you kind of did that too. And what are your thoughts about that?
I suffer the same guilt that my father did or does. I have now become that person. I apologize to my children for putting them second and putting them after a law enforcement cause. And they're understanding of it like I was, and they're a little bit forgiving. And you're not putting me on the spot. I'll share a nightmare story. I was operational one time and I got a call early in the morning, and it was my son, and he was in grade school at the time. And he asked me, where are you? And I was divorced. He's calling me, asking where I am. Where am I? It's early in the morning. What do you need, buddy? And he said, well, where are you? Are you coming? Coming where? Dad, you signed up to be a chaperone today on my field trip. And I was just going operational. And I'm not making it there. There's no way I'm making it. And those moments in time haunt you forever. And that's not because I was an undercover. That was a case agent can experience that. Support staff can experience that. An analyst can experience it. Anybody in law enforcement goes through these things. We get so engaged in our cases and trying to fight the good fight that it consumes us at times. And it does get a hold of us, and we do forget what's important. That's why I wanted to focus so much on family. And it's not what I sacrificed, it's what my family sacrificed.
Yeah, that's so true. I'm glad that you include it in the entire law enforcement family and some of those sacrifices and decisions that you have to make. All right, this is a case review. So I've asked a lot of questions that I thought were necessary to kind of set it up. So you started the case, you've made these connections. Take us from there.
So we're introduced to Charlie Stango. After that introduction, there was a lot of high fives going around because we had made it where the case agents wanted the case to go. At the time, it was a criminal case on a criminal squad that was not a traditional organized crime squad case. It was being oversaw by the criminal side. And as my introduction to Charlie went well, the day I was introduced to him, the Charlies of the world I was familiar with. But when I met him, it was very mob-esque. That's when I became very intimidated and realized when I looked into his eyes and I met him in the diner that morning that, wow, this is going to go down a rabbit hole. I just had that gut feeling. And he was very reluctant to meet me, but he did. And the meeting went well. And he was actually moving his parole out to Nevada. Fortunate enough to have a quick meeting with him before he got on a plane and left. And he says, okay, maybe I'll give you a call. Maybe I won't. You just keep doing what you're doing with my nephew. And, I'll allow it for now. We'll see where it goes. And he did have the Gambinos looking after me and what we were doing in the street while he was gone, as well as the DeCalvacante families. He was very tied into most of the organized crime families he had strong ties to. So he was able to tap into many resources to do that, to look into me, to look into what we were doing, to watch over what we were doing in the street at the time. So everything went well. And then internally, I'll let Anthony describe what happened with the transition of the case going from a traditional criminal squad to the organized crime squad.
As Giovanni said, the case started on another squad, and this case developed as I arrived at Newark, but it was driving towards the DeCalvacante family and Charlie Stango. Giovanni was an undercover employee. That's what he did. And I understood that and I supported that in whichever squad or field office he was helping. But this particular case actually created issues for me coming in to manage the task force because I understood from my boss when I arrived, the task force had been diminished, over time, whether it was resources going towards counterterrorism and just reputational issues and morale issues. And my job was to rebuild this squad. And having a case that really was focused on the area that was my squad's responsibility and was, on another squad and was actually using one of our task force members really as the focus driving that case, that became a little political for me as an incoming supervisor because my squad was dissatisfied with it. And I remember thinking, how do I manage this? How do I manage the squad? And I told Giovanni, I said, I'm going to do something that, I normally would not do, but I'm going to go to my boss and say, look, I need Giovanni working on my squad. I'm going to pull him from this case. And I remember telling him, I said, I'm not going to win this argument, but I said, I need to bring this argument for a couple of reasons, because I needed to communicate to my boss that we need to respect the integrity of my squad. And I need the resources to do that. But I more so needed to communicate to the squad that I was going to fight for them, whether it was right or wrong. So I explained this to my boss, and my boss made the right decision. He wasn't going to let me pull Giovanni from this case. This was was an excellent case, and I respected that. But the byproduct of it was, my engagement with the supervisor from the other squad, and he was a really good guy. And he said, look, we're going to drive this case as far as we can until it crosses into the DeCalvacante family. At that point, we're going to turn the case over to the task force. And I give him credit because he was a man of his word. And that's how the case ended up on the task force. And that's how we ended up managing it. And I'm not sure if I would have done that, in the same scenario after having developed the case. But, ultimately we all ended up working together, both squads, to bring this case to fruition. And that's how I really got involved in helping manage what Giovanni was doing.
In your book, Giovanni, you describe the DeCalvacante family as the thugs, are the most violent family that sometimes the New York organized crime family would use to do their dirty work.
Yes, the DeCalvacante crime family is the longest standing crime family in the U.S. They came over. They were the first Italian mafia family in the country. Despite the stronger five families, the traditional, what everybody knows to be the five families, they are the longest and most traditional crime families in the country. They were just never recognized because they were so small, having a New York and a New Jersey base. The other families overshadowed them at times. And the other families with the Colombo Wars and all that, it overshadowed them at times, moments of just, they got lost in the shuffle. And they were referred to as the farmers because other crime families would farm out their work. And that was mostly the Gambinos would farm out a lot of their dirty work that needed to be done. If somebody needed to be taken care of, somebody needed to get whacked out, somebody needed some, muscling, these guys would be called in. They were traditionally the guys who are referred to as zips, guys that come over from the old world. Back in the day, they were flown into the country, did the deed, took care of business, cleaned up, got on a plane and went back to Italy, went back to Sicily, wherever they had to go. So that's the role of the DeCalvacantes. And I guess it was, and Anthony would confirm, but John Riggi had taken over the family. Sam the plumber, Sam DeCalvacante, was the original boss of that family. And then John Riggi had come in. He was the boss at the time Charlie Horse had gone on. He had just recently been released for a racketeering murder case, and he had been paroled and he was home, elderly at the time, but he had a lot of power. He controlled a lot of New York and a lot of New Jersey, the waterfronts, the unions, all the work that went on in the New York or Northeast area. He controlled a lot of it. So that's where their power came from. And they weren't the brightest bulbs. At times, I think they did an armed robbery or some kind of heist in the Twin Towers, I think, in the World Trade Center. They went up. Guys did a good job. It was a stick-up, I think, and they went in with masks and ski masks. Traditionally, they did a phenomenal job at doing this robbery. They took the elevator down, and then right before they got off the elevator, they took their masks off and just got caught on camera. And they made simple mistakes like that, like any criminal does. So because of silly things like that, they were always looked at as the smaller family, but they did have a lot of strength.
Going back to what Anthony was saying about kind of a tug of war between the two squads for you, and then, the case eventually being transferred over. What was going on with you in the meantime as you're seeing this kind of power struggle or turf war?
So that's important. That's a great question, Jerry. So while it's going on internally with the kind of like a turf war, like you said, going on inside the Bureau, what was going on in my life, in my underworld life, that was my law enforcement life, that was happening in my family, the internal family feud, the Hatfields and Okoys, who's going to take the case. I was blessed to have two supervisors, one being Anthony and the other one being the supervisor of the criminal squad. Two experienced guys that really did, in the end, hashed out like two pros should. But in my criminal world, I was dealing with Jimmy Smalls, doing business with him. He had owed me a large amount of money because of a deal gone bad with us. And we had some merchandise in the street together. We were doing some drug deals. And then eventually along the way, the case agents from the criminal squad, we made a contact and were introduced to Luigi Oliveri. And then the case agents decided, okay, let's put Jimmy Smalls on the back burner. Let's focus on this Luigi Oliveri. And that's where my life was at the time. And then when I was dealing with Luigi, I had built a relationship with him, strictly business relationship. It was great. I was dropping things off to his social club and bringing things into the neighborhood. And we were doing not drug deals at the time. We were just doing swag and counterfeit goods and stuff like that. Eventually, I was introduced to Charlie. And then they told me, okay, let's focus on Charlie. Let's kind of put Luigi on the other back burner. Now I'm trying to juggle all these things in the air. And now I'm trying to develop a relationship with Charlie. So as that's going on, Charlie moves to Vegas and he does eventually reach out to me through channels, through his nephew. And he starts to call me on a regular basis. And we start to develop just a simple relationship, get to know you kind of phase. He was keeping his tabs on me through other members in organized crime, see what I was doing, see if I was legit. And as things went on and he trusted me more, he would call me more. And eventually those phone calls would turn into, listen, go get a different phone number and call this phone number. So I started to get burner phones. We started talking that way. And the relationship had really taken a leap of faith for him. He started to trust in me more, started to acknowledge what I was doing with his nephew in the streets and telling me to be careful. I guess a few months in, he had reached out to me late at night. And by this point, the organized crime squad had the case. And Charlie had left a voicemail for me very late at night. And I received that. And it was just out of the blue. And it was a phone call that said, listen, kid, whatever you and my nephew are doing, and it's illegal, I want nothing to do with it. And do yourself a favor. Don't call me back. So I knew loud and clear what that meant. And that was, don't ever call me again. God help you if you do. Forget you know my name, forget you know me, and forget you know my number. So message received. From that point on, I'd reached out internally within the Bureau, and now we had to mitigate that problem. We got past the who's going to take the case problem. Now we're into the next phase.
So when Charlie Stango makes this call to Giovanni, really his instincts, Charlie's instincts kick in, and he has this nightmare. And, it kind of blindsides us, but, now we have to evaluate, where does this put us, in this operation, and can we overcome it? The undercover coordinator has a responsibility in regards to all undercover operations within the field office to evaluate safety. And he immediately made a decision that Giovanni, it's not safe for him to go face to face with any targets in this case, that he's potentially been blown in this case. And that was difficult for me to manage, as a supervisor, because really in the course of the operation, I need to manage this. I felt Giovanni and myself, with our knowledge of the target, we needed time to evaluate it and see where this was going to go. I had not just worked this subject matter. I worked Charlie Stango 15 years prior. I ran sources, informants against him, made recordings. I understood who he was in his personality. I understood how serious he was, as a gangster. But we had to figure out a way to measure this and figure out whether we could overcome it. But now sort of these blockers have been put in place where now Giovanni, we have to try to manage going forward without being able to go face to face. And really an undercover can't survive that long that way. So I spoke with the undercover coordinator about, okay, well, what do we need to accomplish to overcome this? What do we think would be the measuring stick, the accomplishments? And we came to an understanding that one of the measures that we used was if Charlie Stango is willing again to get on the phone and talk to Giovanni and expose himself to a criminal conversation, he would not do that if he really was steadfast in believing that Giovanni was bad, whether an informant or an undercover officer. So that's sort of the task that we took on. And really what saved us was the fact that Charlie was in Las Vegas. We really had to primarily engage him by phone, but it really goes to Giovanni's skill. He had to manage a whole environment where there were other targets that he had to avoid until we felt that we had mitigated the threat. And we weren't going to eliminate the threat. Look, we're law enforcement. Sometimes we have to go at the threat to evaluate it and to accomplish what we have to do. We don't avoid threat, but you know what? We manage it, we mitigate it. And we got to a point where we met those thresholds, and we got to a point where we could, operate again fully, where Giovanni started to advance the case again.
And the funny thing was, the threat wasn't real. It wasn't that he had gotten information that made him distrust you. It was, it was a dream.
It turned out it was a dream in the end. But what had caused such a spark and created the fire internally was, let's not forget, Charlie Stango is a convicted murderer. He's done the ultimate deeds. He's taken other human beings' lives. I describe in the book my conversations with Charlie, and one of his most memorable quotes to me is, Giovanni, I've killed more people by accident. That's the level of what we were dealing with. So there lies the fear and the safety concerns, and how are we really going to mitigate this while still moving forward in this case? So yeah, it wound up being a dream, and I describe it in the book, and it wound up being something that he explained later on, that he was institutionalized for so many years, 20 years inside, had taken its toll on him. But I think it was more his gut telling him that something was wrong, something was up, because what he described in the dream was just what he thought was just something passing. Probably could have saved him, and he'd be a free man today if he'd listened to his gut. So from that point forward, my relationship with him, I had gone out to Vegas, and it just created a life of its own. I eventually became his most trusted confidant. He treated me as a son over the time that we were together. And I knew Charlie from growing up, not personally himself, but I knew his mannerisms. I knew his ways. I knew that life. I was so familiar with it growing up that he could have been a member inside my family. That's the kind of relationship we had. I was very familiar with his isms and when he would go off the handle, I could relate to that. I could see that in something that I had been exposed to as a child around my neighborhood. I knew people just like him. And I guess I describe it as the characteristics of a sociopath. I was his voice of reason. I became over time his voice of reason and be able to quickly calm him down. Eventually Charlie had come to New Jersey and went on record with the administration, the bosses of the family, and brought me into the pork store, very similar to Satriale's in the Sopranos. That's where the day they went on record with me, not to make me a made member, not to say it that way, but Charlie let the administration know, this is my kid. He's going to speak for me now. He's going to be with me now. He's with us now. And this is the way it's going to be. That was the conversation. And at that point, I just became Charlie's son, Charlie's illegitimate son. He had two sons, I believe, in his true life, but I became the son maybe he always wanted to have. I don't know what drew him to me, but from that point on, he groomed me to the point where our conversations were, he told me what the life was. He told me how to live the life. He told me where to go. He plugged me into most of the 5 families inside them and sent me to meetings on his behalf to speak on his behalf. And it quickly just took a life of its own at that point. Meanwhile, I'm trying to live my own life and trying to make it home to my own family. At that point, he's on the West Coast. Operations are on the East Coast for the most of the part. And then I started traveling to the West Coast. And then it just became a beast of a case. And then eventually we grew to the point where he said, look, you're out in the street now. He gave me the explanation of what it means to fly the flag of the family and how to conduct myself, which I did. And he watched closely from the sidelines, as a coach would do with his team. He would send me into a meeting, and then he would immediately call those associates after the meeting to find out how I conducted myself. He was keeping tabs on me the whole way. And then eventually he had given me the trust of running his crew for him and overseeing, so much so that he put his son under me, and his son reported to me on a daily basis. And that's what we did for the rest of the case. He had made a comment to me one time and told me, listen, even if you're wrong, I'll make you right. So basically it got to the point where there was some internal fighting in the family that went on because John Riggi had decided to retire. He wasn't going to be the boss of the family anymore, and he was going to pass the torch. And the administration was fighting over who would be the next to take the throne. So the family was divided. And of course, Luigi was on one side and Charlie was on the other. Luigi became a made guy in the family. He wanted me to report to him, which caused a sit down in the family. And I discussed in the book the night that Charlie had to come in, actually go to the administration, have a sit down, a meeting with the bosses of the family, with Luigi. They each kind of like a courtroom. You plead your case. Giovanni belongs to me. This is the reasons why. No, Giovanni belongs to me. This is the reasons why. And then the administration, of course, decided with Charlie. He had the status of being a captain, capo. He was a capo regime in the family, and he won, of course. There was some inner fightings with the family because Louis had gotten made, and the process of him being made was not done properly. So the other half of the family didn't see it that way. So there was some internal fighting in the family that went. Louis had his own crew by then, Charlie's crew, which I was part of, and running the daily operations for that. They had started some infighting, and eventually the administration and Charlie decided that they would do the ultimate and decided to put a hit on Louis.
So who did Charlie think you were?
He knew me as Giovanni. He knew me as Giovanni Gatto. He knew I had a history. He vetted me very thoroughly to the point where I did have a criminal history. I did have a true criminal history in my covert name, and he was able to vet me. And there were some law enforcement leaks along the way that we discussed early in the case. He was I think that's part of what caused his nightmare in the beginning. They didn't know what law enforcement agency was looking at them, but they knew they were. It's not to say that there was a leak inside the FBI. They just knew something was going on, whether it was a state case or a local case or a federal case. They didn't know, but they just knew they were being looked at. Eventually, it did come out where the leak was, and that came out, and that was surprising. And that was mitigated in the end. Charlie knew that Giovanni was a street kid, came up with nothing. I had an understanding of an outlaw biker lifestyle that I lived most of my previous life before I met him. And he knew it. He saw it. He believed it. I didn't try to become some character in a movie. I was just myself. And it was the conversations we had. We would sit on the phone like two teenagers for the longest time, just talking on the phone for hours and hours and hours before we conducted any business. And then he got to the point where he would call me at the end of the day. He knew I had a relationship. He knew I had a girlfriend. He was respectful of that. And he grew to love me. And I think part of Giovanni Gatto grew to love Charlie. That's where the mental stressors come in as an undercover. He believed in Giovanni Gatto so much that when I was at his home, and I would leave Vegas or I'd head back to the Strip. He would encourage me, take 2 bottles of water. It's very dry out here. You have to stay hydrated, and he looked out for me in that way. That's the kind of relationship he had. It wasn't just a criminal thug life. It was a genuine love and respect. And he knew I flew home to New York, and he knew I lived in New York. And he would say to me, call me when you land. It's snowing back there. Just let me know you got there okay. Just give me a call. Like any uncle, like any parent, like anybody would do. I was accepted into his family. I was accepted into the other members of the family. So there lies those daily stressors of, these people genuinely share their true life with you, which can cause a whole nother. While you're missing your family, these people are telling you how much you mean to them. You have that feeling of guilt that you're not with your true family. And you have that feeling of guilt that, wow, these people are not in their life. They're good people. And I'm about to destroy their lives when all these arrests go down. That's a heavy weight to bear.
Yeah, you do talk about that at the end of the book. Even years later, as you're telling us about this, the feeling that you had for him and the guilt and grief that you felt.
Yeah, I think it was because it was such a long case. Cases this long, Jerry, they don't end this way. I mean, they don't end with somebody being relocated for the most part. Most cases just end and you move on to the next case. This one really struck home because in the beginning, people would say to me, why you? Why were you so close to home? Why would you put your family in that situation? And because I lived and breathed that life, I understood it. It's like speaking another language, it's a certain dialect. If you don't speak a certain dialect, then people know right away you're not part of that culture. So it had to be me. I think Anthony had summed it up and said you couldn't pick somebody else to fly in from the Midwest or out, on the West Coast to fly in to do this. You had to be here every single day to live amongst these people.
You just brought up one of the things that you mentioned in the book that I thought was really telling, and it was the long conversations that you would have with Charlie and how your wife at times was very suspicious because you would be on the phone with this guy for 2 hours. She was kind of thinking like, how is this possible? Who is he really on the phone with?
Right. And we're law enforcement, both of us. So we're suspicious to begin with, right? We look at all the little ticks and the tells anyway in somebody. You meet somebody at a barbecue and it's just inherent that we're sizing them up right away, right? We want to know. So I did come home and I would sit in my driveway for a good amount of time. with the kids at the window wanting me to come in and then eventually falling asleep. And then I couldn't go inside. I had to stay on the phone. And or nights when I did come home and I walked in the front door and went right into another room in the house. And yeah, totally looking back, of course it was suspicious. And, my behaviors were very odd. And she would say, how could you? You were just with this person or this crew. You were with you guys all day today. But this is a life. When you're in this life, and having experienced living this life, let me tell you, this is a full-time job for these guys. It is a full-time job. But for me, it was, I had to report back to my case agents. I had to make sure my reports were done, which I was self-admittedly terrible at. So, I had to make sure all my paperwork, my internal stuff was done. And then my usual task force paperwork had to be done. The trainings, the internal trainings or agency trainings had to be up to date. And, it's a tough life to juggle. So yeah, she was very suspicious of it. But in the end, I was fortunate. She had given some quotes and she had a great understanding that opened my eyes to my relationship with Charlie. And many years later, she came to understand that I lost Charlie out of my life as if you would lose a member of a family, because I did my relationship with him in an odd way. And please don't take it the wrong way. I knew what Charlie Stango was capable of. And I knew he was a gangster's gangster. I never lost sight of that. I never got wooed by him and I never had to live the life of a gangster. I always had a good balance, but I could see the good in Charlie. I could see the caring part of Charlie, because same as me, he grew up that hardened way, that callous way at times. And I could identify with that. So it was more the guilt of, like I had said earlier, the guilt of leaving the other family members behind, the people who were not part of the quote unquote, the life. They were victims of it just as I was and my family was. So, but yeah, there was a time when she explained that the death of Charlie, him going to jail was equal to me losing an uncle or losing a father or losing somebody close to me in my family because it was torn from me. But more importantly, at the end, I was torn from my law enforcement family because of this case. That was the biggest emotional wounds that I suffered.
Yeah, definitely. I want to get into that just a little bit later. We haven't really talked about what you did for Charlie. I mean, obviously, we know that it's all about money. What was it that you did to earn money that you would eventually kick up to him?
So he was very methodical in that. He would he would allow me to operate. By that, I mean, he wasn't making me kick up to him until he knew what I was capable of and what I could do. Once I had proven myself to him and he watched, eventually the call came to me and he called me one night and said, you're doing pretty good. Everything's going well. You're making some money. I'm glad. I'm happy for you. Everything's going good. You're making us look good. Just keep it up. That would be his coaching of me. Keep it up, kid. You're doing good. And then he'd ask me for updates. Hey, did you go see that guy Carmine? Yeah, I went to see Carmine. Yeah. From the other Borgata. He would call the other families of Borgata. So yeah, you went to see Carmine and the other Borgata, right? How'd that go? That went good. He said to tell you hello and things went good. And it looks like I'm going to be able to do some business with him. And I never asked him, you want a piece of this? I always knew he would ask when the time was right. And eventually it did come in the form of a phone call one night and says, hey, you're making pretty good money, kid. You're doing good, my boy. Yeah, Charlie, everything's going good. All right, well, I'll tell you what, if you got a little extra cash, a car payment or a telephone bill payment or something like that, it'd be appreciated. And then eventually that's how it grew to him wanting to be kicked up. That's how the conversation took place.
I'm shocked. I would have thought that would have been from the very beginning. Otherwise, why would he want to have anything to do with you if not from the very beginning, you being, a source of income for him?
Well, don't forget, I wasn't the only person that he was allowing to operate. There was his nephew and there were other people in the family. So he was allowing these things. So he could have been getting kicked up from other other people. Like Carmine, for example. Carmine could have broke him off a piece if he was a trusted guy. Jimmy could have been giving him a piece of something. It's like an investment. You got to give it some time. And I think that's what he did with me he was a very skilled criminal. He's a gangster when it comes to the mafia. He knows what he's doing. He's a very smart individual. Charlie he's not a stupid man by any means. He might not be book smart and educated, but business wise and numbers, and he knows what he's doing. He's brilliant in that aspect. He knew to buy his time and wait and see what the return on his investment would be. And then when he realized that I was making good money, he had put me with the Gambinos and I was making some money with them. So again, I don't know if he was getting a piece of what they were getting with me. And then eventually when he trusted me enough to say, okay, it's time for you to start reporting to me and kicking up. And that's what we would do.
How were you making money with the Gambinos? What was it that you were doing?
So a lot of it was swag, which was counterfeit goods. If they had something, we'd buy it. If I had something, they'd buy it. We were doing those kinds of things. I was still doing drug deals here and there, trying to do what we could with people. And then it just, it jumped the shark from there. Eventually, we started to plan hijackings and we started to plan armed robberies. We didn't carry any of them out, obviously. But when that level of trust was there and I knew of somebody that had a warehouse, it was like, well, are you friends with these guys? No, I'm not friends with them. I do business with them. Well, let's rob them. Well, let's just stick them up. Let's go in there, do a robbery. We'll go in there. We'll pistol whip the manager and stick them all in a room. And, well, you know what day they get paid? You know what day payroll is? Yeah, I know what day payroll is, but, so let's do it.
Why
Those
not?
little things along the way. Why not? The opportunity's there. And as I started to run my crew, we'd go out to dinner and I would speak on Charlie's behalf and his son would be there at the dinner. And, these guys were criminals. They were down and out criminals. And there were nights when they told me, Giovanni, I need to make money. Christmas is right around the corner and I got bills to pay. I got this, I got that. Okay. We'll make it work and we'll work it out. And they would come to me with some jobs. And of course, we didn't do violence. We stayed away from that. I kept them at bay by kind of feeding them a job here, a job there, or planning something out. And eventually they came to me with the prostitution idea and wanted to run that. They kicked that up to Charlie. I left it for them to discuss that with Charlie and him and his son did that. And there were the drug deals along the way. And eventually Charlie knew of the cocaine purchase that I was making and he knew that I was in the drug business. And, I explained in a book how we kind of got into that. And he did eventually say to me, okay, well, how much are we making on this? And again, he stuck his hands in my pocket. How much are we making on this? And then it was, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you over here. And this guy's got really good stuff. Go do business with him. And then he knew he would get a piece of that. So then, he was approving the narcotics deals that I was doing.
Yeah, from what Giovanni's explaining, I think, your law enforcement audience is going to really understand how difficult what he was doing turns out to be. So Giovanni's out there developing his credibility based on perceived criminal activity. So to the extent we have a stockpile of recovered goods, he can get out there and make it appear as if he's selling, he can sell these goods. They're not truly stolen, but he can make money and he can present himself as an earner in this environment. But, the real difficulty, comes, when he gets to that point of running a crew for Charlie. And now they come up with these ideas, which are true violent crimes, which Giovanni, as an undercover, he can't commit a violent act. He can't sell true drugs. We can, he can make it look like he's making money doing that. But that's an incredibly difficult balance to maintain. And once you get into that level of the case, the days are numbered. The case isn't going to progress a whole lot further because you can feel you're going to get into a position where it's too difficult. You can't get out of it. Or if he has to back out, his credibility is going to really come into question. And that's the difficulty of what the environment and the work that he's doing. When you look back at Charlie's nightmare and his perceived questioning of Giovanni's credibility, we overcame that. But there were also other issues that developed that really undermined, Giovanni's credibility. And, it kind of goes back to, what you were describing about the difficulties of balancing personal life and the work life. And it's difficult on both sides. And when you have a lot that you're juggling in your entire life and you come to work, sometimes things just don't work out and there's failures. But when those things happen, it has a ripple effect. And we had issues where, some failures contributed to really difficulties for Giovanni to maintain his credibility. And a lot of this culminated into the evolution of the case. And the way Giovanni explains, there was a natural power struggle developing within the family, a natural jealousy, a natural aspect of what people can relate to in their own lives and their own work But here we're dealing in an environment where it becomes a life or death matter.
Yeah, so I guess we're at the point where Charlie now is asking Giovanni to kill someone, his rival that he initially fought over Giovanni for. And of course, Giovanni can't do that.
No, he cannot. So just before that occurs, what happens is, and again, I hope people buy the book and read it because there's so many more stories and it goes into the deeper side of it. Things had broken really bad with Luigi. As Anthony describes, the jealousy or whatever. Luigi knew he had lost me to Charlie, and Charlie was almost sticking his chest out and thumbing his nose at Louis that he won. And it didn't sit well with Louis. So early on, Louis had asked for a meeting with me, and I was kind of blowing him off. The case agents didn't want me to meet him anymore. I had an associate of mine who Louis had reached out to and said, look, I want a meeting with Giovanni. Where is he? And this associate had set it up on his phone. And ultimately, some things broke bad with the meeting. Louis had gotten a text that he should not have gotten. And he thought very bad of me. And they had made surveillance one day and followed the surveillance back to the FBI building. Unbeknownst to me, Louis had a bad taste in his mouth from me from that point forward, and things weren't going well for me. So I did eventually have a meeting with him, and he did threaten to, basically kill me or chop me up into pieces. And we mitigated that just fine, and things went on. And then eventually Charlie just did not like the way Louis had gotten made. The administration didn't like the way Louis had gotten made. Charlie had shared that with me at dinner one night. And again, our conversations were very, very out in the open at this point. And he was sharing what the administration's feelings were and what his feelings were and my feelings should be. And he did eventually come back to me and say, yeah, the administration has decided to do this. Oh, okay, wow. And you're going to do it. And there was a long pause. So I'm going to do it. Well, yeah, why not? And then it was always, you could look into Charlie's eyes. He had these ice blue eyes, and you look into his eyes and he says, do you have a problem with that? And what are you going to say? No, let me go back and check with my SSA. Let me go back and check my SAC. As long as they approve it, I'm up for it. I looked at him and I said, sure. I said, if you feel that way, sure, I guess, And then that's when he told me, be the man you were born to be, Giovanni. You're my kid. Why do you have a problem with this? No, I don't have a problem with it at all. And that's when they tasked me to do it.
All right. Well, definitely that's going to bring the case to a quick end.
You would think.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jerry. And, I distinctly recall getting the call from Giovanni, when he's about to board the plane to come back from Las Vegas. And he tells me he's got the order from Charlie Stango to kill Luigi. And for me, it's exactly what you described. It brings clarity to the case because this case has to come to an end. It's something of, I can't say it's a blessing, but it's definitely, it brings clarity, but it's also a curse. It is a burden because Charlie asking an undercover to do this in itself is not a crime. It's clear he has an intention to commit a serious crime, and we know he is a serious criminal. But at this point, we have matters that we have to deal with. In many cases, in most cases, this is the most difficult of matters, the most important of matters that we deal with as law enforcement, the threat to someone's life. And now we have to figure out how to manage this. And in many cases, we would notify the party that has a threat against them, that this threat exists in an effort to protect them. But, in this particular environment, it's more complex than that. It's much more complex. And we have the difficulty of trying to disrupt this from happening to develop the evidence to get a case on Charlie Stango and everyone else who's agreed to do this in the midst of managing and making sure that Luigi Oliveri is not harmed. And now, how do you do it? How do you get that done? And a lot of this, relies on Giovanni. So now we've got a very difficult operation, and now you've magnified it. And from that point where I get that phone call, before his plane lands back on the East Coast, I'm already putting actions into motion within the organization to get the right approval, to get FBI headquarters to give me emergency approval to proceed with this. Because the reality is, if we do make notification, it's not long before Oliveri or Charlie Stango realize who provided this information to the FBI. And at that point, we'd have to pull Giovanni. And at that point, we have two members of a violent organization who know that they're after each other. And the reality is we could create a war within that family, but now have no ability to stop it from happening. And that's really what creates the necessity for Giovanni to go deeper and to try to manage this, to get the evidence, while we do everything we can to make sure that this doesn't get assigned to anyone other than Giovanni. The more difficult task for me, rather than just getting approval from the FBI, was getting approval from the U.S. Attorney to do this. And as normal course, I needed concurrence from the U.S. Attorney's office to do this. And I ended up, I recall, on a Christmas Eve conference call with the U.S. Attorney, explaining our plan and what we needed to do this. And we needed wiretaps to really know what was happening in the family, what they were saying when Giovanni wasn't talking to them, to know whether he was going to be double-crossed, whether there were other plans out there to kill Giovanni or Luigi Oliveri.
So at this point, the only type of recordings you had were the ones that Giovanni was making?
Absolutely. Yes. In this environment, we didn't have unlimited resources to have wiretaps and 24-hour surveillance on these targets. And so, really, Giovanni is the tip of the spear. He's the one who is managing all of this. And the key for me in getting those wiretaps and getting the U.S. Attorney's approval was, before he would approve it, he wanted me to put into writing what the FBI was going to do to make sure this threat didn't come to fruition, essentially putting me in the position to take responsibility for it. I did it, and I was happy to do it because it needed to be done. And that's where we went for the next 3 months, managing this matter to get the evidence we needed to disrupt this plot.
I didn't realize in reading the book that this assignment for Giovanni, for you to kill Luigi, lasted for 3 months. To be able to put Charlie off and not have done it immediately must have taken a lot of convincing from you to him that you were going to do it.
Well, there was. The convincing that I was able to do it and I was capable of doing it, Charlie believed that because he knew who Giovanni Gatto was. He had spent enough time with Giovanni Gatto to understand that I was capable of doing such a deed. And he believed in me that I could. But in his mind, 3 months is a long time. But in my world, 3 months felt like 10 years because it was a daily tick, tick, tick. Every second of my day from that point forward was planning the murder, how to do the murder, how does he want it? Because initially it wasn't just one murder. It was a couple of murders. And then they only left one on the table. So we mitigated it down to one. And they came to me and they gave me this task. In my mind, I still had to run a crew. I still had the daily operations of the mafia crew to deal with, what my guys were doing, what my guys were making, what I'm kicking up to Charlie. Charlie wants his kick up at this point. So I'm running daily operations. Every single moment of my day was accounted for. And then I had to make time to catch up with my case agents, to catch up with the bureau and make sure all these reports are done, or, it was total chaos in my life. And I did this by introducing, and he knew I had an outlaw biker background, and he knew my only family was an outlaw biker. He knew my mother had passed, my fake mother, in that fake life. And they knew I was with bikers and they knew I had connections to bikers. And I kind of I led him to water to think, why not use your biker buddies? He met my biker friends. He met these two physical, imposing individuals, and he knew they were what they thought of me. He went to dinner with them, ate with them, and said, I made him understand that why would I use somebody in my crew? Why would I put your son in that position? Because this internal war that's about to explode inside the DeCalvacantes over who's going to take the throne, that was going on at the same time. So crews were pitting against crews. My crew was getting a little spun up because they knew the inner fightings of the power struggle. They wanted to lash out at Louis' crew. Louis' crew was lashing out at my crew, making threats at my guys. My guys wanted to go get guns and go at them. I had to talk them all off the ledge for that. And then Louis wanted meetings with me because he was trying to set me up and potentially take me out because I wasn't a made guy. He wasn't being looked at as a made guy. He looked at it as the boss made him. Who am I to act like a made guy? Who am I to do this? And then Charlie was trying to set himself up for after this whole thing would happen, where does he land? And during this 3-month period, he did let me plan the thing with the bikers, and I used them. And he kept asking me, what's the deal? What are we doing here? Are we going to do this? If he took that off the table at any minute, Jerry, it can mean one of two things. It can mean the administration doesn't want to do this anymore. So this is not a good idea. Who planned this? Who knows about this? We don't want this to get out in the family that this was going on. So we just need to cut all ties to it. And who would you cut? First one you cut out is me. So any moment I was doing a meeting or I went out to Vegas, I was afraid, is this the day that Charlie and the administration decided they're not going to carry this thing out and they're just going to get rid of me and get rid of the loose end? That's 101, what would happen. And here I am in Charlie's house wondering, how things are going. He's excited about the hit. We're sitting in his dining room. We're sitting in on his couch next to each other watching TV, and he's giving me pictures of Louis and talking about how to do it and describing it to me and driving in my car on the Vegas Strip. And he's just so excited that this is going to happen. And he's telling me how to do it. He's giving me step by step, be careful of this, do this, do it this way, do it that way. Walk in there and just kill him. Walk in there and just boom, 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 hit him down, knock him down. He was just so excited about it. He wanted to be there with me. That's a scary moment because, again, I realized what he was capable of, what he did to a gentleman in the past who was called to a meeting. We knew that's the murder he was convicted of. Billy Mann was the guy he killed. He lured him to a meeting in New Jersey and gunned him down in the car. And here I am driving in a car with the same guy, 20 some odd years later. And he can do the same to me in a heartbeat. And that's what's going in the back of my brain. Did I say goodbye to my kids? Did I say the right thing to my kids before I got on a plane and flew out to the West Coast? Did I have the right conversation with my wife the last time I talked to her? Did I say everything that needed to be said? That's the things that were going through my head at the time, on top of planning this. But I had Anthony there. Zampogna was there, and I knew he had the reins for the executive branch. I knew he was controlling it, and I knew if anybody I had him there. And it was a breath of fresh air for me to know that here was an experienced SSA who had an understanding of this and had his finger on the pulse internally and had my back.
You mentioned two things, the fact that they could decide not to do the hit. And the other part of it that you didn't mention was they could also assign it to someone else.
Yes.
And I guess that's what Anthony is really concerned with too.
Well, because on the T3, sure. Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, that's why there was the absolute necessity for the wiretaps. That's where we needed to know what the tone of the discussions were outside of conversations with Giovanni so that we could manage this as best we could, because there is so much, as Giovanni explains it, there's so much at play at this point. And if the tone changed at all, we would have to immediately take the case down. We were in a race. We were in a race to get the evidence we needed to pull these guys off the street before really this whole family exploded.
So in addition to the great recordings that Giovanni was getting from Charlie directly, meeting with his biker friends and discussing how they were going to do it, which I take it is exactly what you were looking for. Were you also getting information from his telephone conversations with the administration and other members of different crews?
Exactly. So that we were very much in tune to. So to the extent that Giovanni's having a conversation that's significant, we're communicating that back to the case agent and to the wiretap room to make sure that they're poised, to see what conversations are coming next. Who is Charlie going to reach out to and capture those relationships? Because that really is the evidence. And Giovanni does a great job of pursuing the conversations that he needs to pursue. And that's another incredible balance of, existing in the underworld, yet evoking conversations from the targets that fit a federal statute. Giovanni, was trying to capture those conversations and those acts that can ultimately end up in criminal complaint or an indictment. And that's why it's so complex, the work that he's doing.
So everybody's successful. Giovanni's successful in getting the recordings. The electronic surveillance is successful in capturing the words that are going to be a part of the indictment. And so he's indicted and arrested.
He was. And just before that, one of my last conversations with Charlie, and he was excited because the advancement of him in the family, he explained that to me. He explained who was to take over the new position as boss and the new administration and who that would consist of. And he was part of that new administration coming in. Just as promotions in law enforcement happen, it happens in the Cosa Nostra world as well. He explained to me in his living room that he was going to potentially be upped from captain. He was very cautious. He explained to me that in November, this was just before the arrest, and he was explaining, so this was sometime in February, maybe January, February, he had explained to me in his house that he was anticipating taking a higher management role within the administration, and then pointed to me and explained to me that I would be upped as well, and I would be proposed for membership. So to be a made guy. And that was exciting because at that point, internally, I wish, and I think Anthony's with me on this, I wish they would have said to me, look, it's off. And because that's the ultimate goal, right? For law enforcement, we would love to have one of our own made, that's the ultimate, that's the haiku. So I'm wishing and hoping and fighting internally with myself and emotionally just, how could I figure this out? Maybe we could put this off. What would it be like to be made? But in the end, thank God I had the training I have, and I was experienced enough to say, you know what? We've taken it this far. We've all done a good job at every level, from analyst to the SAC in the field office. We've all done a good case. And you know what? This is as far as it goes. Now it's the prosecutor's job. We take the evidence, we hand it over to them. We know we have a slam dunk. We did a phenomenal job as a team. One day, maybe after this, there'll be a guy who comes up after me, and he'll get that little treat of being made, or something will happen, or whatever happens in the mafia, and you have to leave it for another day and put it on a shelf. So the arrest did take place, and Charlie was taken into custody along with a few other members. And at that time, some of the other members, it was comical because some of them actually told their wives or their girlfriends to reach out to me immediately, to call me, because they knew I was out on the West Coast, and get a hold of me and tell Giovanni to run, just tell him to run. And that came back from the arresting officers. So that was kind of like a little bit of a treat for us. So they actually believed them until the end. Wow. And then Charlie was taken into custody, and he was processed, and he was told that it was me. And he kind of figured it out right away. I guess it was kind of obvious.
Yeah, that had to be devastating for him because he called you and treated you like his son.
Sure. Mm-hmm. But then in a true gangster's form, he gave me a little reminder. He wanted to be called the night that I was going to kill Louis. And I had a conversation with him in his garage, and he saw me off out of his driveway that night, and he was so excited. And he said, I said, do you want me to call you after it's done? And he knew it was going to be within the next day or so. He says, yeah, call me up. I said, well, what do you want me to do? You want me to call you? What do you want me to say? He said, just call me up and say, hey, Charlie, it's me. I washed my face. What? You just want me to say I washed my face? He goes, yeah, just say I washed my face. So in the arrest room, there was, it's videoed in there, and in the processing room, and he was on video and apologizing to his girlfriend / wife, apologizing to her, and just, that he was going back in the can. And then he looked up to the ceiling and just said, Giovanni, wash your face, Giovanni. So I took that as, either go kill myself or, I hope you get killed or whatever.
And we'll talk about that threat in just a bit. I do want to acknowledge that, I've interviewed Joe Pistone and Jack Garcia, and just like you, they got to the point where they were being considered to be made, as a made member of the mob right when the case was pulled down. There's at least 3 that we know have almost gotten there. And it has to be, again, personally, because we're all, achievers and, alpha dogs and want to, reach that high level. But it is amazing that at each point when it gets to that level, there's something that makes it necessary to bring the case down.
Yes, absolutely. And just like any other good athlete, please, coach, leave me in for one more inning, coach. Leave me in for one more period. I can do this. You always want to stay in. You don't want to leave. But the right call is always made. And that's when we're not desperate for that trophy as an organization, because desperation leads to failure.
Right. And it's about the bigger thing. It's about the case and the bigger goal and not
Right.
personal goals.
Right.
Anthony, any thoughts about that?
Absolutely. Exactly, what you described, it goes to the professionalism of putting, the personal achievement aside to stay focused on what the reality was. And it goes back to the issue, we had a threat to life that we had to resolve. And it took everyone, being focused and a professional to make sure once we got to that point, once we had enough to disrupt it, we had to take action to do it. And everyone followed through. And that's very important. And ultimately the case comes down. And it's when a case like this comes down, look, there's a short period of time when, you sort of pat each other on the back and it's great, what was accomplished. It's interesting to look at it now, years removed, in what Giovanni wrote about the case, because when you're living it and you're doing it, yes, I thought it was a very good case, but you know what? It's one of many cases that's happening. And the reality is the undercover portion of this case was only a portion of it. This was going to be the springboard to moving further in the hopes that Charlie Stango would cooperate and then open the door to his history of experience in this life. Because, when Giovanni, captures that conversation with Charlie Stango, where he says he killed more people by accident, that's a genuine statement, and I believe that's true. He's thinking of something when he says that. We started to put together the picture of murders that we believe he was involved in and knew about, and we hope that we can get there. But Charlie Stango's a true gangster. I believe he will take certain murders to his grave, and we may never solve them.
So he did not cooperate?
He did not.
So what kind of time did he get?
Charlie was sentenced to 10 years.
So he could be out in 2025?
Yeah, give or take, right around there.
You mentioned briefly that all of this was occurring, all of your undercover role, all of the connections you were making within the same area of New Jersey where you lived. And so now everything is over. The case is taken down, arrests are being made, but there's still lots of people that you've been in contact with who now know that you were an undercover agent, that you're responsible for what is happening to the mob in New Jersey. And you're right there. You could meet them at the grocery store. You could pass them at the mall. And nobody seems to have thought that far ahead about what they're going to do with you and your family for your safety.
No, and at that point, even during the case, I knew we were going to different places where I went in my true life, malls that I shopped in my true life. And it got to the point in the case where I didn't live a life with my family. Even when I was home and not operational, we didn't go out together at that point because some things that happened, I discussed in the book, and the incident at the soccer game and different things that occurred. After that, we decided collectively that we're not going to be in public together anymore. And because of the safety of our family, we did that. Yeah. And after things had happened, the realization of Charlie being transferred back to the New York, New Jersey area after he was processed and taken into custody. And then his wife or girlfriend moved back to the area as well. And we were practically related by then. At that point, we treated each other like family and told each other how much we felt for each other and cared for each other as a family. So we stood out, could bump into anyone, And you know how it is, Jerry. You could walk through Main Street in Disney and you always bump into somebody you know from the past.
It has happened more than a few times.
Right. And it's just one of those things and we're law enforcement. So Murphy's Law is, if it can happen, it will happen to us. So you really have to be on guard for that. So yeah, we just tried to mitigate it as best we could. And then eventually everybody was arrested and some were released on house arrest, and as was I. From that point forward, I didn't go into division anymore. I didn't go out and have coffee with my coworkers and my case agents and guys I knew in law enforcement. I couldn't meet anybody for lunch because it was just too much of a chance that, God forbid. So I stayed home as well. I stayed in my backyard. I lived in my backyard, and I waited for a leaf to fall off a tree and land in a pool so I could scoop it out. But the only problem was there were no trees in my backyard. So my days were long days. I isolated and I kind of sat by myself. My wife still was on the job and had to go to work every day. So she had to take care of the kids, go to work, pick the kids up, take them home, feed them, do whatever, get them home to me. I would cook. It was almost as if I was on house arrest as well.
Well, Anthony, it's my understanding, because I've interviewed a number of agents on this podcast about it, that during the case, There's always a psychological evaluation, someone checking in. How are you doing? How are things going? Are you still fit to do this job? But it sounds like after the case is over, that's not happening anymore.
Well, the issue of potential threat is something that Giovanni and I are discussing, as the case is winding down and as we're getting to the point of making arrests. And, it's something, as you described, the FBI is experienced at this and they're very good at evaluating, looking at the extent of what, the undercover has done and what could be the ramifications of a situation like this. And in a lot of cases, you're dealing with an FBI agent, and if getting them out of that environment is something that is necessitated based on the work that they did, it's fairly simple. You just give them a transfer. And that happens a lot, but this was a curveball because Giovanni was a police officer in the state of New Jersey. And now we have to figure out how to put, a square peg in a round hole. How do we address this? I can tell you honestly, there was, a lot of questions, like you're asking within the FBI. Well, how did you get to this point? Well, Giovanni explained well. We didn't plan for him to end up in this role this deep in an organized crime family. It just evolved that way. There's also the criticisms of, well, look, we're all law enforcement. This can happen to all of us. Why should we take any steps here? But what, we're not all delving and advancing ourselves personally into a criminal organization where, the resentment can be that deep that, as you described, if they see him at a grocery store, emotions may take over, and that's a threatening situation. So we talked a lot about, well, how do we mitigate this? For me as a supervisor, I was managing the needs and the expectation for Giovanni and his family in relation to operating within a large bureaucracy. And that took time. And that's where, as Giovanni described, he had to kind of sit tight for a little bit because, look, his true identity wasn't revealed, but the issue of just running into somebody was a threat. And we had to figure out how to get him relocated. That ultimately was the decision, and the decision that his family felt most comfortable with, although it was a disruption personally to his life. But getting that done for somebody who part of the FBI structure and family, but not a true employee, took a lot of management. I'll say this, his police department didn't question it at all. They understood it. His safety was paramount. So they were on board with him relocating. But it took probably approval from 5 different sections within the FBI to get this done. I had to deal with how did we end up here? And there is no perfect undercover. There's no picking the undercover from the West Coast and employing him within the DeCalvacante family to make his way to almost being made. No, my answer was exactly what this story tells you, which was we got to where we were because of Giovanni. He came in a cameo role and it evolved into something very deep. And I don't think anyone else could have gotten to where he did get in this family and develop this case. Ultimately, the FBI comes through and they foot the bill to relocate his family. But this is something that Giovanni and his family have to deal with in the future. It's great work, but it comes at a price. I give him credit for what he was willing to do to make this happen.
So in a sense, it wasn't just a relocation, it was a forced retirement because his job now as a police officer and task force officer is over.
In a sense, I guess you could look at it as that's my sentence. Everybody else was sentenced in a case, and that's the sentence that I was given, not in a resentful way. It's just the way that the chips fell. And Anthony's right. My home department was very supportive of it because, as you had mentioned early on, I was more of a federal task force officer for so much of my career that when that meeting came, I think their response to Anthony and our executive management at the time was, well, he's more yours than he is ours because he's been a federal TFO for how many years? Almost 20 years at that point. I guess you can look at it as they were sentenced to their prison time, but I was also sentenced as well because my identity and everything I knew, and there was no going back for me, Jerry. There was no promotions that occurred with guys that I had worked with through the years, and I would normally be there during their promotions or their retirement parties. There was no going back for those anymore. There was no going back for funerals. The logistics of me traveling back would be a nightmare. For the Bureau, for me, for my family, the stress it would put on them. So there was that separation, just as Charlie has been separated from his family for 10 years. I've been separated from my life just as long. But I think Charlie being an old school gangster, they do understand when it comes to guys like myself and Joe and Jack. They look at it as a profession. It's a cat and mouse game. Sometimes we win, sometimes they win. I would hope to think, part of me is hopeful that they understand that, I paid the ultimate price just as much as they did. I have to reinvent my life just as when they get out, they have to reinvent theirs. I've had to do that. That's been the biggest, my wife leaving the job, myself leaving the job. I had a huge issue with disconnecting from everything I knew. Again, I've been in law enforcement since I was 21 years old. And now here I am being forced to retire when I had another 10 years left in me. But you move on and you reinvent yourself. Now I'm blessed that I could share my experiences and I can be involved in trainings and stuff like that and serve a purpose.
Are you happy?
I'm happy. I'm healthy. My family is happy and healthy. My children don't understand. They don't know why one day we were there and the next day we were gone. There's a lot of resentment there because they missed their life that they knew. Again, they were so small that we couldn't share the details with them. Yeah, you live in the moment. I got to be thankful that I have my family, that we stayed as a family unit. My wife is, God bless her. She stayed with me through all of this craziness. And
God bless her, definitely.
God bless her. Because wow. God knows there was a roller coaster, and she's been through so much herself, as I describe in the book. She didn't deserve this. And she kind of knew. She had the foresight to say, this is not a good idea. This is not going to end well for us. But like we are undercovers, just like any law enforcement, we're addicted to adrenaline. We love adrenaline. That's our drug of choice. And it's hard to say no sometimes.
Well, we've talked for a long time. This is a long episode, but there is so much more in the book. So I just want to remind everyone that they need to check out Giovanni's Ring, My Life Inside the Real Sopranos, if they want to get the full details about this case. Fantastic book and a fantastic career that you've had.
Thank you, Jerry. And I'm truly honored that you had us on, and I'm honored to do this with Anthony. I'm blessed to have him in my life. He has been an anchor for me through this whole thing, and I appreciate his friendship as well as his oversight in the case.
I like to ask my guest when and why they joined the FBI, and that will still apply to your case, Giovanni, when and why you decided to become a federal task force officer. So, Giovanni, why don't you start, and then we'll let Anthony answer the question.
I knew at a young age that I was going to go into law enforcement. I was always a fighter for the underdog, as I describe in the book, and what brought me to that. Despite of how I grew up and the things and the violence and darkness that I was exposed to and saw, I knew I always wanted to do the right thing. I always knew that I wanted to be the voice for others and to stand up for what was right, as kind of superhero as that sounds. But that's what I believed in. It was given to me, instilled in me by my father. The fear no man aspect is carried on into law enforcement, and I wanted to be there for others, make the wrongs right as best I could. And then that just upped the ante along the way. I always trusted my gut. My gut led me into narcotics, led me into the undercover world, and the life that I had as a young child was the beginning of my training for that. I always thought, if you're going to do something, do the best job you can. And that's what I felt was my effort. To do undercover work was the best that I can give my country. To be called a true patriot by members of law enforcement is the best honor you could ever have.
And you mentioned it briefly, but what are you doing now?
As I said, I help with the trainings, and I'll do speaking engagements, share my experiences as an undercover, share my experiences as a law enforcement officer. But more recently, I had gotten into the stressors and the de-escalation trainings for law enforcement, and I provide those for other companies. I helped recently organize and institute trainings for law enforcement and guys that are suffering from burnout, guys and girls that might have some substance abuse related. So getting them the treatment for trauma or substance abuse. And that's kind of where my direction is going now.
And Anthony, why and when did you join?
The FBI and law enforcement really wasn't on my radar growing up. I came from a family of bricklayers, and I was part of the first generation in my family to go to college. So it wasn't until I was studying accounting at Villanova University, and I was getting to the point of applying for jobs. And back in those days, I remember being in the career office and everything was paper. There was nothing electronic back then. And I was submitting resumes to hopefully get interviews for job opportunities. And I had one extra resume by happenstance. and I didn't want to carry it back to class with me. So I wanted to find a bin to drop it in, and there was one for the FBI, and it said they were looking for accountants and lawyers. And I thought, oh, this will be an interesting conversation. Let me see what they have to say. And I remember getting an opportunity to talk to the recruiter. He interviewed me. It was Alan Jordan out of the Philadelphia office. And he really opened my eyes to a world beyond what I ever had thought I could be a part of.
I know Al Jordan.
I never forgot him. He gave me an application. He said, look, go get some years of experience. And if you still want to do it, you're thinking about it, drop the application. And that's exactly what I did. I remember being at a crossroads of saying, I really enjoy what I'm doing, as an accountant. But I thought, if I don't like the FBI, there's plenty of accounting firms out there. I could always go back to this work, but there's one FBI. And I needed to see what it was about. Luckily, I got the opportunity. They hired me, and I never looked back. Got to be a part of some incredible work and investigations and work with some great people. Great career choice and a path to follow.
When did you retire, and what are you doing now?
So I retired in 2018, found an opportunity with Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company, to conduct external fraud investigations. So I really jumped at the chance because I really wanted something that gave me the core of what I did in the FBI, which was build investigations. That's what I enjoy, and I still get to do that. I don't arrest people anymore. I don't need to do that, but I really enjoy the work I'm doing. And I think one of the most difficult things for FBI agents leaving the bureau is, you leave the mission. That's what really drives you, the responsibility of what you're doing. So leaving the FBI and joining Pfizer, now I get to be part of the mission of protecting the work of Pfizer, of providing breakthrough drugs that change people's lives. And, in the midst of the past year and dealing with the pandemic, being part of an organization that has world impact, it's been really satisfying, and I'm glad I made the choice.
I like to give my guest the last word. Anthony, why don't you go?
My career, my opportunity to work for the FBI was a wonderful opportunity to be involved in very impactful work. And I think this is an example of it. So, Giovanni's book and Jerry, your podcast, really, it documents my participation, my small part of a greater effort. And to me, it's something that I will be able to share with my family now and into the future. So it's really a gift. And I have to thank you both, Jerry and Giovanni, for the opportunity to be with you today.
Thanks for that, Anthony. It means everything. And I really appreciate the opportunity again, Jerry, for coming on and getting to share our experience in my life. I am very humbled and honored that people pushed me to do the book, to write the book, and wanted to hear the story. I encourage anybody in law enforcement to read it, try to walk away with some kind of message to decompress or how to deal with stressors, or maybe it can help them in some way. That was the original point of writing it. I wanted it to be a teaching thing, not to just tell my story of the infiltration of the mafia. So hopefully that message resounds with some folks. I would encourage anybody looking to get in the field of law enforcement. I would push them to do everything they can, whether to start at the local level, state level, and the federal level. Ultimately, the three of us are biased because we work for the Bureau. I wasn't a sworn agent, but I was always treated as family. It's such a great organization. I would push anybody to join the FBI. Commit to doing the job and take it as far as you want to take it. Just follow your gut. Just do what your gut tells you to do. It'll never steer you wrong. It's kept me alive this long.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find photos of Giovanni and Anthony, as well as several articles about Operation Charlie Horse. There is, of course, a link to where you can purchase Giovanni's book, Giovanni's Ring, My Life Inside the Real Sopranos. There's also a link to where you can listen to more FBI retired case file review episodes about organized crime and working undercover for the FBI. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. I would also love it if you checked out the link for my books in your podcast app's description of this episode. My nonfiction books, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And then there's the companion book, FBI Word Search Puzzles, Fun for Armchair Detectives. My FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad crime series features flawed female FBI agent Carrie Wheeler in Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. All of my books are available wherever books are sold as ebooks, print books, and audiobooks. If you've already picked up copies of my books, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.